We'll be using some naming conventions for all of our scripting in this course, and this may be new to you if you're a self-taught programmer. In a professional setting, there's always going to be some kind of style guide for naming conventions, so let's just get into good habits. Naming conventions help with readability and consistency, especially when you mix and match code from different developers. And though there's no single standard for naming conventions, I have tried to follow some common ones that are used for C#. I'm using Visual Studio as my text editor simply because it's more accessible than ever now, and it's available on both Mac and PC as of this recording. To switch to Visual Studio, download the latest build from Microsoft at visualstudio.com, and then in Unity, go to your Preferences, and then under External Tools, select Visual Studio for your external script editor. You're also free to use MonoDevelop or any other text editor of your choice, but the videos are all recorded with Visual Studio and Unity 2017. I'm going to create a new class called Example just to illustrate my naming conventions, and I prefer to use certain rules for formatting my C# source code, especially with the opening and closing curly braces aligned. Now it is default in Visual Studio, but just to make sure, you can go to Project, Solution Options, and then select the source code, code formatting, select C# source code, and verify that this is how you like your indentation and formatting. If it's not, just hit Edit and make changes as appropriate. And you can modify all of these. You can change the rules for new lines, spacing, and indentation in here. And I generally like the defaults, but if you want to change something, modify your settings and then hit OK. You can always go to Edit Format, Format Document to reformat the script to make it follow your formatting rules. Let's see how things are going to be named in our example class. Class names are always going to be Pascal case. The first letter of each word is capitalized, and there are no underscores. The name is always a noun, so node, graph, map data, etc. In my case, my class is just called Example. If I had named it Example Class, the C would be capitalized. But my class name needs to match the file name, so let me change it back to Example. For my method names, these are also always Pascal case, and the name is a verb-noun pair. So I could make a method like do something, public void, do something, and see that's a verb-noun pair. For variables, if a variable is a public member variable, it's going to be camel case. The first letter is lowercase, and the first letter of each subsequent word is capitalized. And you just squash the words together with no underscores. They sort of look like the humps of a camel, hence the name camel case. In this case, I could create a public integer called max iterations, public int max iterations equals 0, and I try to keep the variable names descriptive. The only exception to that is if it's a local variable acting as a counter, where you'll often see me abbreviate and just use simple variable names like I, j, x, y, etc. For int I equals 0, I is less than, max iterations, I++. If the member variable or field is private, I'm going to put an m underscore prefix in front of it. And this helps differentiate between variables that are member variables or fields and local variables used in the methods. So let's say I wanted to create a private integer to keep track of my maximum number of iterations. I would declare private int m underbar max iterations equals 0. And I don't need to write the word private out since it's default in C#, so you're going to see it omitted in all the lessons. We're just going to assume that if the access modifier is not specified, then it's going to be private. So at a glance, I can tell the difference between a local variable and a private member variable, and this is especially useful inside of your methods, where you might want to compare a local with a class variable. So let's say I have a local variable, iterations. If iterations is less than m max iterations, I can clearly tell what is what. Now you may notice that public variables and local variables can look a little bit alike, and usually you can tell them apart from context, but also In many cases, we'll be using public properties instead of just plain vanilla public variables. Properties are structured a bit more like methods with their set and get accessors, and we're going to name them in Pascal case. So in general, you'll be able to tell them apart from local variables from the capitalization. While this naming convention is not the only way of doing it, and nobody can force you to follow it, it does make your life a little bit less miserable in the long run. And when you start working with other people in a professional setting, it just becomes part of your daily coding life. So I suggest you get used to using one. Now, the most important thing above all is consistency. You don't really need to follow any particular naming convention, but if you're consistent, you can always just do a find and replace and fix any naming standards really quickly. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the subject. So to sum up, here's our naming rules. Just follow this slide until everything becomes a little more familiar. And that's probably the last I'll say about the subject. Try to use a naming convention and get used to it. It's just better for you. Okay, let's get our project started in the next lesson.